The wind hadn't quit for hours. It came in sharp, cold bursts down the canyon, rattling the canvas walls of the tent, whistling through the bare mesquite branches outside. The fire Silas Cordell had built before sundown was nearly dead now. Just a bed of glowing coals under a half-collapsed rack of sticks. Silas sat with his back against the rear pole, hat pulled low shoulders, hunched inside his heavy coat. The Henry rifle lay across his thighs, barrel pointing toward the flap. He wasn't tense, but he wasn't relaxed either. 4 years of living alone in country like this had taught him never to be fully off guard. The war had taught him that. He left the uniform in 1874 after the campaign in Red Rock Canyon. What he'd done there, what he'd been ordered to do, still sat in his gut like spoiled meat. The villages they burned, the screams, the silence afterward, and how he'd stood there holding the line, pretending he wasn't watching. Out here, he didn't have to answer for any of it, didn't have to talk. That was the point. He was chewing the last of a hard biscuit when the tent flap moved. Not from the wind. A hand, maybe. One sharp pull. His eyes snapped open. His grip tightened on the rifle. Years of habit had trained him to wait. One breath. Two. Then he saw her. A figure ducked low through the flap, paused, then took a single step inside. The firelight reached her legs first. Bare, scratched, caked in dust. Then the wool blanket wrapped crooked around her body, burned at one corner, soaked in ash. Her hair was black, tangled, stuck to her cheek with sweat or tears. She was shaking but trying not to. Silas didn't lower the rifle. Not yet. She said nothing. No pleading, no tears. Just exhaustion. Her eyes were wide but dry. She looked like she had already decided this man might hurt her, but had nowhere else to go. He kept watching her, tone flat as the desert. "You alone." She gave the smallest nod. Her chin trembled. "Someone chasing you." She shook her head, slowly. No one was chasing her. She'd been cast out, left to die. Silas lowered the rifle but didn't set it down. He reached behind him and pulled out the spare blanket. Thin wool torn at the hem, but better than the one she had. He held it out. She didn't step forward, her legs trembling now either from cold or the effort of standing still. He dropped the blanket at her feet. After a moment, she bent down to pick it up. Her knees buckled slightly as she moved, and she let out a breath that sounded more like pain than relief. When she sat, she chose the far side of the fire pit, cross-legged, eyes down, wrapped in both blankets now. The tent flap fell closed behind her. He didn't speak again. Neither did she. The quiet was heavy. Silas leaned back against the pole and watched her through the low firelight. She had to be Apache. Her face, her frame, the way she moved. But he didn't ask. Out here, after what he'd seen during the war, questions could cut deeper than knives. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, thin from hunger but strong-boned. Shoulders that had carried more than one winter. He noticed her feet again, split at the heel, bleeding in places. She'd come a long way barefoot. That meant desperation, or exile, or both. He pulled his coat tighter and stared into the coals. No words passed between them for the rest of the night. She didn't sleep at first, sat still, blanket tight around her, flinching at every snap of a log in the fire. She kept one hand tucked under the edge of the blanket, and he figured there might be a knife there. Good. That meant she wasn't completely helpless. When she finally did sleep, it was shallow, restless. She curled in on herself like a child, feet tucked up, teeth, clenched shoulders, trembling even under both blankets. She never turned her back to him, not once. Silas didn't sleep at all. The fire burned low. He added 2 more sticks. Toward morning, she shifted in her sleep. The blanket slipped off one shoulder, and he saw the edge of a dark bruise across her collarbone. A muscle twitched in his cheek. He didn't look away. She didn't stir. The sun came slow pale through the canyon mist. When he finally stood stretching his back with a quiet grunt, she flinched awake, sat up fast, eyes wide again. "Easy," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Just feeding the stock." She offered no response, but she didn't run either. He stepped out of the tent and into the wind. It was colder than before. He pulled on his gloves, adjusted the scarf around his neck, and walked toward the tethered mules. Behind him, he heard the tent flap shift, but not open. She was still there. That was enough for now. By midday, the sky had cleared just enough for a pale sun to cut through the haze. Silas knelt by the fire pit outside the tent, coaxing flame from a few dry twigs. He'd already hauled water from the creek and set beans to soak. Behind him, the girl had emerged. Slow, hesitant, wrapped in the same blanket. Her feet were now wrapped in torn canvas he'd left out the night before. A crude attempt at shoes. She hadn't asked. She'd taken them, which told him two things. She didn't expect kindness, and she didn't know what to do with it when it came. She squatted near the fire and held her hands over the heat. Eyes down. Silas didn't push. He handed her a tin cup filled with weak coffee. She hesitated, then took it with both hands. Drank slowly. She offered no thanks. But every drop disappeared. That was enough. Silas watched her movements, how she cradled the cup, how she glanced at his rifle resting beside the stump, how her shoulders went rigid when the wind kicked up. She was used to danger, but she hadn't run. Not in the night, not at first light. That meant something. "You got a name?" he asked. She didn't look at him, but after a pause, her lips moved. "Ayasha," she said quietly. He gave a single nod. "Silas." She didn't repeat it. He didn't press further. He knew better than to pull stories from someone who didn't trust him yet. But there were things he needed to know. She was young, maybe 24, maybe younger, but her eyes looked older than his. That kind of weight didn't come from wandering. It came from being cast out. After breakfast, he set about checking his traps. She followed him, unnoticed at first, then by the crunch of gravel behind him, then by her shadow when the sun shifted. She kept her distance but matched his pace. When he crouched beside a snare, she crouched nearby, watching. One of the traps had caught a hare. Another held nothing but a broken twig. He reset both in silence. At the third trap, she stepped forward, motioned for his knife. He looked at her hand. Slim fingers, calloused palms, a few small scars along her wrist. Not soft, not careless. He handed over the blade. She crouched, cut the hair from the wire, cleaned it with quick practice movements, and wrapped the meat in a piece of canvas. When she handed back the knife, she met his eyes for the first time. There was no gratitude in the look, a steady, searching gaze, like she was still deciding if he was safe enough to stay near. Back at camp, she skinned the rabbit and laid the hide flat on a rock without being asked. He noticed the way she worked. Precise, methodical, the kind of skill passed down by necessity, not choice. Silas patched a rip in his coat while she worked, but halfway through the needle snapped. He cursed under his breath, dropped the fabric, and stood to check his kit for another. Ayasha stood, took the coat from where he'd left it, and sat with it in her lap. She pulled a small bone needle from a pouch beneath her blanket, threaded it with something she'd unwound from the hem, and began stitching the seam herself. She asked for nothing, and Silas didn't stop her. That night the fire burned longer. She cooked the rabbit with a few wild onions he'd pulled earlier. They ate in silence. She didn't touch his rifle. He didn't ask where she'd come from. But after they'd eaten, after he'd fed the mules and checked the perimeter, one last time she stood beside the fire and pointed to the sky. "Storm," she said. He looked up. Clouds were gathering fast over the ridgeline. Wind had picked up again. Colder this time. If snow came early, they'd be stuck for days. He nodded, tossed 2 more logs on the fire, and ducked into the tent. She followed close behind, crouching low to avoid the flap. Once inside, she wrapped herself tight in both blankets again and sat near the fire pit, legs tucked close, eyes half-lidded from exhaustion. He pulled off his coat and boots, laid the rifle beside him, and sat down with his back to the rear pole. They didn't speak again, but when the wind howled outside and the canvas groaned under the strain, she inched closer, not touching but near enough to feel his warmth. She flinched when a gust slammed the flap but didn't move away. He stayed still. Let her decide how close was safe. Let her draw the line. Later, when the fire died down and only a faint red glow lit the space between them, she lay on her side, head on her arm, eyes half closed. But before she drifted off, she whispered something so faint he barely heard it. "Why didn't you touch me the first night?" Silas stared at the coals. His face went hard as stone. He didn't speak right away. Then, quiet as the wind outside, he answered, "Because you didn't want me to." She offered no reply, exhaled slow and steady, and closed her eyes. And in the space between them, something settled that hadn't been there before. Trust would come later. For now, this was enough. And for the first time in years, Silas let himself close his eyes while someone else was still awake. Because he knew she wouldn't run. Not tonight, not anymore. The storm came hard in the early hours. Not snow like Ayasha had warned, but sleet. Sharp, frozen rain that hammered the canvas roof and soaked the ground outside into thick red mud. Wind pushed hard against the tent walls, making them sway and creak. Inside, the air was cold enough to see their breath. Ayesha had pulled the blankets tight around her and curled into a ball close to the fire pit. Silas had fed the coals 3 times through the night to keep the damp from settling in their bones. By morning, the ground outside had turned to mush. One of the mules had chewed through its tether during the night and wandered up the hill. Silas found the tracks cursed softly and spent nearly 2 hours coaxing the animal back down the slope, his boots caked in freezing mud. When he returned, Ayasha had boiled water and was soaking a bundle of herbs in it. He didn't ask where she'd gotten them. She must have collected them days earlier and kept them wrapped in her things. She offered him a cup. The taste was bitter and unfamiliar, but it cut the cold in his chest. He drank it all. Afterward, he set to sharpening his traps. She watched for a while, sitting near the fire, rubbing warmth back into her hands. Then, without a word, she picked up a length of rawhide cord and began repairing one of the broken snare loops he hadn't gotten to yet. Silas paused, glanced over, then went back to his work. They didn't need to speak. That was becoming clear. Later that day, the storm moved off, leaving behind wet air and slick stone trails. Silas considered packing up and heading south, closer to the winter trade routes near Dragoon Pass. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was the weight of Ayasha's presence. Maybe it was the way she kept stitching his coat without being asked, or how she stirred the beans to keep them from sticking to the pot. Small things. Quiet things. But they added up. That afternoon, she finally told him what happened. They were sitting near the fire, Ayasha shaping a handful of soaked mesquite pods into paste with the side of a tin can, her fingers moving slowly, eyes on the task. "My people," she began, tone rough, "they say I bring misfortune." Silas didn't look up from the rabbit he was cleaning, but he heard every word. "They said the sickness came because I stayed after the child died. They blamed the storm, the horses running off, the empty traps. They called me cursed." She paused. He still didn't look at her. "They left me in the dry hills. No shoes, no food. They took my brother." Her voice cracked then, barely. "They said he'd be better without me." His teeth clenched. He finished cutting the rabbit and set the knife aside. "How old is he?" he asked. 7. He nodded once. "You know where they took him?" She shook her head. "I think a mission, near the trading post. They said the priest there takes orphans." Silas let the words settle. Comfort wasn't something he knew how to give. But he looked at her then, really looked, and he saw something different in her face. Not fear, not sorrow, determination. That night she didn't sleep, curled in a ball. She lay beside him under the same blanket, her back facing his chest, inches apart, close enough to feel his warmth. He felt her breathing slow, steady, and for the first time she didn't flinch when the fire snapped or when the wind made the tent walls tremble. In the dark, he kept his eyes open and stared at the canvas ceiling. He thought about the mission near the post. He'd passed through there once, months ago. A white-walled church, faded cross, children with shaved heads and blank stares. He remembered the priest's voice, too smooth. He remembered the way the man had looked at the Apache boys like they were stray dogs he was training. He hadn't liked it then. He liked it less now. He didn't say it, but the decision was made. If the boy was there, he'd find him. Redemption was a word for preachers. This was about doing what was right. The next morning, he handed Ayasha a pair of his thick wool socks and told her to pack light. They'd move out after breakfast. She looked at him for a long time, not questioning, not thinking, seeing him. Then she nodded. They broke camp before sunrise. Silas didn't speak much. He rarely did. But his movements were firm-focused, the kind of quiet that meant a decision had been made and wouldn't be unmade. He packed only what they needed: dried beans, coffee, flint, the traps he hadn't had time to reset, his rifle, and the last of the rabbit meat wrapped in cloth. Ayasha rolled the canvas tight and secured it with rope while he cinched down the mule packs. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. The trail south toward the mission trading post was rough, not a path so much as a memory of one. Game trails split and faded into brush, and the rock underfoot was slick from the storm. Silas walked ahead, leading the mules by the reins. Ayasha followed close behind her feet, wrapped now in the patched leather moccasins he'd dug out of his pack the night before. They were too big, but she didn't complain. By mid-morning, the sky cleared, and the sun pushed through in cold light, casting long shadows across the canyon walls. A hawk circled overhead. Silas stopped once, listened, then turned west off the trail. They crossed a dry wash and climbed a low ridge to avoid a fallen cottonwood. When they reached the crest, the land opened wide below. Flat basin country stretching south, broken only by distant cottonwoods and a thin plume of smoke far off near the horizon. The mission. They didn't talk about what would happen there, but the weight of it rode with them. By evening, they reached an old line shack, half collapsed but dry. Silas tied the mules to a piñon root and started a fire inside, using branches torn from the broken roof. Ayasha sorted their supplies while he cleaned the last of the snare wire. When the fire caught strong, she took a seat beside it, legs folded under her, the lines in her face softening for the first time in days. "Why do you help me?" she asked, voice flat and cold. Silas didn't answer right away. He was checking the stock on his Henry fingers, tracing the crack along the grip. "Would have helped anyone in that storm," he said. She tilted her head, unconvinced. "Not the first night." He looked up then, not at her, but at the space beside her, his face hardening. "I've been around enough camps to know the difference between a woman asking for shelter and one expecting to be taken." He said it without anger. Plain truth. Ayasha looked at the fire. "You didn't ask anything of me. You still don't." Silas gave a small shrug. "Don't mean I'm good." "You're not bad," she said. He didn't reply. Went back to the rifle. Later, after they ate, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small bundle of cloth. Inside was a carved bone token, an Apache sign, worn with time. She handed it to him. "My brother carved this before they took him," she said. "If the priest still has him, he'll recognize it." Silas turned it over in his hand. It was simple, a circle with a split at the top, symbol for a hawk's cry. He nodded once and tucked it into his pocket. That night, as the flames dwindled, she sat closer to him than before, not touching but near enough that he could hear her breath steady and deep. She didn't flinch when he pulled the blanket over both of them. Her head rested against his shoulder, and for a long time they said nothing. But in that quiet, the air between them changed. There was no urgency, no expectation, a silent agreement of two people choosing the same direction. By morning, they were moving again. The land flattened as they neared the mission, sagebrush and dust giving way to worn wagon ruts and split-rail fences long since weathered gray. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance. Silas slowed his pace. Ayasha's face had gone tight, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. "We go in together," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "Yeah, all right, but if he sees you and tries to take you back, he won't." Silas said it calm but final. They reached the edge of the mission around midday. The courtyard was crowded, half-starved boys herded by an older woman with a switch, a drunk trader asleep under his wagon, and the priest standing near the well sleeves rolled speaking to one of the townsmen. Silas stepped forward, slow and steady, his rifle slung across his back but visible. His boots echoed across the packed dirt as he approached. The priest turned. He was younger than Silas remembered, slick hair, clean coat, and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you, friend?" the man asked, voice soft. "I'm looking for a boy," Silas said. "Apache, name's Maddo, about 7. Might have come through a few weeks back." The priest raised an eyebrow. "We take many orphans here. I'd need to check the rolls." Ayasha stepped forward then. No words. Held up the bone token. The priest's face flickered. Then he forced a smile. "That one, yes. He's here." Silas's jaw tightened. "Bring him. Perhaps we could speak in my office." "Now," Silas said, voice low and flat. There was something in the way he said it, something cold, final, that made the priest hesitate. He nodded, turned, called out. A moment later, a small boy was led out by another woman. His clothes were clean but hung loose on him. His hair had been cut short, but his face was Ayesha's. Same sharp jaw, same dark eyes. When he saw her, he froze, then ran. Ayesha dropped to her knees and caught him in her arms. He was crying. She was too. Quiet gasps muffled against his shoulder. Silas looked away, gave them the moment. The priest cleared his throat. "You can't just take him. There are papers, custody rules, the law." Silas turned back to him, close. "He's not yours," he said. "And you think he's yours?" Silas reached into his coat, pulled out a folded document. Army letterhead. Forged but good enough. It gave him temporary custody for relocation of tribal youth under protective services. The priest's eyes went wide, then narrow. "This is highly irregular." "File a complaint," Silas said. "We'll be gone by then." He turned and walked back toward the gate. Behind him, Ayasha followed, carrying her brother in her arms. They didn't speak until they were clear of the mission walls. Then, breathless, she said, "You didn't have to do that." Silas kept walking. "Yeah," he said, "I did." They'd made maybe 2 miles when Silas heard it. Hoofbeats, fast, coming from behind. He turned hand already on his rifle. 3 riders cresting the hill. Rough men, bounty hunters maybe, or worse. The lead rider was tall, gray-bearded, with a scar running down his neck like a rope burn. Dutch Keller. Silas recognized him from wanted posters in Fort Verde. Claim jumper, deserter. The kind of man who'd sell children to missions for $20 a head. Keller reined his horse to a stop 15 feet away. Smiled. It was the kind of smile that made decent men reach for their guns. "Well, well, Silas Cordell, heard you went soft, living in a tent like a hermit." He spat into the dirt. "That your woman?" Silas said nothing, shifted his weight, putting himself between Keller and Ayasha. "See, here's the problem," Keller continued. "Father Crane pays good money for Apache boys. You just cost me $50. "Then you should have picked a different line of work," Silas said. Keller laughed. I like you, Cordell. I do. So I'll make this simple. Give me the boy and we ride away. You keep the woman. Do whatever you want with her. Ayasha's hand tightened on Maddo. The boy pressed his face into her shoulder. Silas's voice went cold, flat. No. Keller's smile faded. Wrong answer. He reached for his gun. Silas was faster. The shot cracked across the basin. Keller's horse reared. The bullet had missed intentionally, slamming into the rock beside Keller's boot. A warning. Next one doesn't miss, Silas said. Right away. Now. Keller's two men looked at each other, nervous. They weren't getting paid enough to die, but Keller wasn't done. This ain't over, Cordell. I know where you camp. I know where you trap. And one night when you're asleep, he leaned forward in his saddle. I'm going to take everything from you. Then he turned his horse and rode north, his men following. Ayasha exhaled slow. She'd been holding her breath. He'll come back, she said. Silas nodded. I know. They made camp in a shallow cave that night. Maddo fell asleep fast, exhausted from the day. But Ayasha stayed awake, staring into the fire. You said you fought Apache before, she said finally. Silas looked up from cleaning his rifle. Yeah. What year? He paused. 1874. January. Her face went still. Where? He didn't want to say it, but she deserved the truth. Red Rock Canyon. The fire crackled, loud in the silence. My father died there, she said, voice flat, empty. Silas set the rifle down, slow. What was his name? Dakota. He had a scar on his left hand, from a bear trap when he was young. Silas closed his eyes. He remembered. A man rushing out of a burning lodge. Axe raised, coming straight at him. Silas had fired without thinking. Center mass. The man went down, and Silas had seen it, the scar, on his left hand as he fell. I killed him, Silas said. Ayasha didn't move, didn't cry, stared at him. You sure? Yeah. The silence stretched, forever. Then Ayasha stood, walked to where his rifle lay, picked it up, turned it toward him. Silas didn't move, didn't reach for his sidearm, looked at her. If you're gonna do it, he said quietly, I won't stop you. She held the rifle steady, finger on the trigger. 10 seconds passed. Then she lowered it. You saved my brother twice, she said, voice shaking. Once in that canyon, once at the mission. If I kill you, he loses the only man who ever protected him. She set the rifle down. I can't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I can choose not to make Maddo an orphan again. Silas nodded, throat tight. That's more than I deserve. She sat back down. Far from him this time. Back to the fire. Tomorrow we keep moving, she said. We build that cabin, we raise my brother, and you spend the rest of your life proving you're more than the man who killed my father. Yeah, Silas said. I will. They moved deeper into the canyon the next morning. The old trail narrowed between sloped rock faces and brush thick with rabbit tracks. But Silas knew a place. An abandoned line station tucked against a rock wall, forgotten after the last cavalry patrols faded out years back. The roof had collapsed and half the log wall was missing, but the stone foundation held. Water was nearby. Firewood was plenty. He figured it could be something again. It was the first time he'd returned since the war. Back then, he'd used it to sleep between orders. Now he was coming back with something else in mind. He stopped the mule at the ridge and looked down at the clearing. Ayasha stepped beside him, Maddo holding her hand. The boy had warmed some speaking in soft whispers to his sister, even answering Silas in quiet nods. But he stayed close, always close. Ayasha followed Silas's gaze across the clearing. This is where you want to build. He nodded. Enough stone left to frame out a wall. Roof will take time, but it's a start. She didn't question it. Then we'll need to dry meat while it's still warm out. That was it. No ceremony, no speech. Shared purpose. They unpacked everything by noon. Mato carried stones from the old pit to mark a cooking ring. Ayasha set up the canvas as a shade lean-to, while Silas started digging out what would become the new root cellar. They worked until sundown. No complaints, no wasted movements. Silas notched each log with a hand axe, fitted them tight, the kind of joinery that would hold through 50 winters. Every task, no matter how small, was part of building something that might last. By the end of the second day, they'd raised a frame of upright logs braced with rope and stone. Ayasha boiled strips of sinew to bind the beams. Mato helped by pressing clay between cracks in the wall to keep the wind out. Silas worked until his hands bled. That night, while the fire warmed the clearing, they sat close and watched the shadows dance across the half-built walls. "This feel like home?" Ayasha asked, brushing wood shavings off her skirt. Silas didn't answer right away. "Feels like a place that could be," she nodded. "Better than running." Mato had fallen asleep nearby, wrapped tight in one of the wool blankets, his head resting on a folded sack of beans. Ayasha shifted closer, arms crossed against the chill. "You know," she said quietly, "when I was little, I used to think a man could never belong to the land unless he was born on it. And now I think belonging is something you build, not something you're given." Silas reached for her hand without saying anything. She let him. They sat like that for a long while, fingers laced, backs resting against the new wall. The stars were out clear and sharp overhead. The canyon wind had died down again. It felt like the land was breathing softer now. The next morning he found Mato stacking rocks into a circle, trying to shape a chimney with twigs. When Silas walked past, the boy looked up. "Is this ours now?" Silas crouched beside him, watched the small hands place a flat stone on top. "It is, if we keep working at it." Ayasha stepped into view, carrying a basket of wild onions in mesquite pods. She smiled faintly. "Then we better not stop." By the end of the week, they had 4 walls. No door yet, but the wind didn't bite as hard anymore. Inside, there was a place to sleep, a corner for food, and a small spot where Mato had arranged 2 stones and a stick like it might someday become a table. The attack came 3 nights later. Silas woke to the smell of smoke. Not the fire pit. Something else. Something wrong. He grabbed his rifle and rolled out from under the blanket. Ayasha was already awake, pulling Mato close. "Stay down," Silas whispered. He crept to the doorway. No door yet. The open frame. Outside, the brush near the tree line was burning. Someone had set it. Then he heard the voice. "Cordell!" "Keller!" Silas stepped outside. The fire was spreading fast, cutting off the east trail. Keller stood on the ridge above, silhouetted against the flames. Alone this time. His men must have abandoned him. "You took my money," Keller shouted. "You humiliated me. Now I take your life." He raised a Winchester .73. The crack of 44-40 echoed across the basin. The bullet spanged off the stone wall beside Silas. He dove back inside, returned fire. Missed. Keller laughed, started down the ridge. Ayasha appeared beside Silas, his Henry rifle in her hands. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "What you taught me," she said. She'd been watching him clean and load the rifle every night, watching how he aimed, how he breathed. She stepped into the doorway, raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel. Keller was halfway down the ridge, close enough now to see his face, the scar on his neck, the hate in his eyes. Ayasha fired. The Henry bucked hard against her shoulder. 200 yards, center mass. The kind of shot that meant the difference between living and dying. The shot echoed across the canyon. Keller stopped, looked down at his chest, at the red bloom spreading across his shirt. He dropped to his knees, then fell forward. Still. Ayasha lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking. "I killed him," she whispered. Silas took the rifle from her gently. "You saved us," he said. Mato ran to his sister, wrapped his arms around her waist. She held him tight. The fire burned itself out by dawn. Keller's body lay where it fell. Silas buried him in a shallow grave north of the cabin. No marker, no words. Dirt. 3 months later, the cabin stood complete. 4 walls. A door with iron hinges Silas had traded for at the post. A chimney that didn't smoke. Windows covered with oiled canvas that let light through. Maddo had started talking again. Full sentences. He helped Silas with the traps and called him Sir at first, then simply Silas. Ayasha's belly had started to swell. Not much, but enough that Silas noticed. Enough that she'd smiled when he touched it that morning and asked, "You sure?" They'd married a month after Keller. Standing beside the half-built cabin with Maddo as witness, Silas had carved 2 rings from copper wire. Simple, strong. One evening, Silas sat on the porch he'd finished. Maddo was inside drawing on a piece of slate. Ayasha sat beside him, her hand in his. "You think Keller was right?" Silas asked quietly. "That I went soft?" Ayasha looked at him. "No," she said. "You finally figured out what you were fighting for." He squeezed her hand. The canyon wind blew soft. The fire inside crackled warm. And for the first time since the war, Silas Cordell felt like he'd come home. Silas and Ayasha Cordell raised 4 children in Copper Canyon. Maddo became a scout for the Union Pacific Railroad. The cabin still stands today, marked only by a stone foundation and a copper ring buried in the ash.